going to begin recording. So, thanks everybody, and after those kind of long introductory remarks, welcome to CTAC's Patient Input Consultation for Sofosbuvir, a new NS5B inhibitor that's been developed by Gilead Sciences to treat hepatitis C. My name is Paul Sutton. I'm one of the policy researchers here at CTAC, and I'll be leading us through today's webinar. For those of you who aren't as familiar about CTAC, the Canadian Treatment Action Council, CTAC is Canada's national civil society organization addressing access to treatment, care, and support for people living with HIV and hepatitis C. And one of the key components of our work is to meaningfully engage community members, service providers, and policymakers around treatment access-related policy and program needs and solutions. And one of the key focuses of our work is to steward patient input when new HIV and hepatitis C medications are moving their way through the drug regulatory pipeline, in order to make sure that the voices of people living with HIV and hepatitis C, as well as people who provide services to people living with HIV and hepatitis C, are heard in this really crucial component, of the process, especially when really promising new medications, such as Sofosbuvir, look like they're approaching the market and being able to really substantially improve treatment health outcomes for a lot of people living with hepatitis C. And so that's what we're doing here today. And in order to accomplish that, then, I want to do three things. The first thing that we're going to do is go over some basics about the common drug review and how drugs come to market in Canada. And so this will be a pretty broad strokes piece, but it's just to get everybody on the same page about exactly why we're here today and the role of all of us as either patients or as community leaders or as members of civil society organizations or service providers or what have you, of the role that's available to us to inform how a new drug comes to market and under what conditions. Then I'm going to talk about, and seeing some of the names here on the screen today, I'm going to feel a little silly and maybe a little bit remedial. I'm going to talk about the current standard of hepatitis C treatment and specifically what are the needs in terms of an improved treatment profile. And for many people on the webinar today, we're all very aware that there are quite a lot of needs in terms of improving hepatitis C treatment. And from there, we'll move into what improved needs are met by Sofosbuvir. And this will be, if any of you participated in the webinar that I provided on Sofosbuvir, a new protease inhibitor to treat hepatitis C being offered by Janssen that we conducted in August, you'll notice that this talk is a little bit different because one of the things that I'm trying to gesture towards here is the uses that we know Sofosbuvir can have right now to improve treatment outcomes for people living with hepatitis C. But the complicated piece in the case of Sofosbuvir will be, as we go through this webinar, the role Sofosbuvir might have that we don't really know yet in terms of optimizing hepatitis C treatment outcomes and potentially its role in leading toward a truly functional cure for hepatitis C for almost anybody who's living with hepatitis C. So it's going to be looking at how Sofosbuvir is moving ahead in the regulatory process right now, but also the future needs that I think a lot of us will have heard a few different things about, right? But the future needs and uses that Sofosbuvir may have. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay. So the first thing that I want to do is to go over a little bit about the common drug review and market access. Basically, the big question that's posed by this section is, how do medications become available in Canada? With the specific caveat of how do medications become available on publicly covered pharmaceutical plans in Canada? Because we know what the case is, as is the case for hepatitis C, as it is for HIV, that for drugs which have a higher amount of cost, higher cost that can be borne by one individual person or even by people's, by some kinds of drug plans, that a lot of people, in fact, the vast majority of people access hepatitis C treatment as well as HIV treatment, but in the case of today, hepatitis C treatment through public formulary that's either provided through disability or social assistance coverage or provided as a catastrophic drug plan in Canada. And so here's how the decisions that are made in terms of what drugs get covered, when, where, and under what conditions. So in Canada, drugs come to market in basically 3 steps. Health Canada, the major national health regulator, has a role to play that when a new pharmaceutical product is being developed and has shown a certain amount of safety and efficacy studies, I'll talk about those 2 terms in just a second, the pharmaceutical developer submits a bunch of data to Health Canada, and Health Canada decides whether a drug is safe and effective and is allowed to be marketed or sold in Canada. And at that point, Health Canada gives that drug something called an NOC, Notice of Compliance, basically the certificate that allows something to be sold in Canada. Okay. So that means that a drug then is available here. But then the question that we then have to ask ourselves, because Canada has a patchwork health system that doesn't make universal drug coverage available to everybody across the country, is how then will those drugs actually be paid for people who may not be able to afford them, and so, or for people who are a part of a public drug insurance plan. And so then that information is then sent over to the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology in Health, and they operate the Common Drug Review. And the Common Drug Review is responsible for assessing the safety, efficacy, and cost effectiveness, I'll talk more about this in a second, of new medications in Canada. And then in turn, they take this data, this assessment, and send it to all of the public formularies in Canada, of which there are 19, 1 for each province and territory, as well as 6 federal formularies, including one for the Canadian Forces, the Correctional Services of Canada, the Interim Federal Health Program, non-insured health benefits, which covers status First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in Canada, the Public Service Health Program, and the Special Access Program. The Common Drug Review and its assessments that it makes are considered by all of the drug plans with the exception of Quebec, which makes its own assessments. So it's a 3-part process, the first one having to do with safety and efficacy, the second one having to do with both of those things plus cost effectiveness, and then the decision that's made based on all of that information by each of these public formularies is, can we afford it? What changes will this drug make to the people who live in our province or in our territory for stakeholders? What is the approval of this? What's the impact, both positive and negative, going to have on the health system? So I talked about and I just want to go over this quickly again, the Common Drug Review looks at 4 specific things when it makes these recommendations that it's then in turn going to make to the provincial and territorial and federal formularies. It looks at, is the drug safe? Is the drug comparably more effective than current therapies that are being used? What does it cost? And not just the sheer cost of the new medication, not just the dollar value, but is it going to reduce the amount of hospitalization? Is it going to reduce people's impact or need of other social supports? Is it going to reduce adverse events that need to be treated with their own medications or support systems and what have you? And then the 4th and final criteria that the Common Drug Review looks at is patient input, which is why we're here today, because one of the things that the Common Drug Review is going to want to see in a little over a week and a half when the input period closes is, what do people living with hepatitis C, people who may have taken Sofosbuvir as part of a clinical trial, people who are waiting to undergo hepatitis C treatment until treatments improve, what do service providers think of this new medication and what it might mean for the future of hepatitis C treatment and its availability and accessibility? The Common Drug Review then has a series of decisions that it can make. So we provide them with this information, and they come up with a series of possible listings. One is to list the drug, which is when the Common Drug Review says this drug is obviously a clinical benefit. Its costs are in line with what we currently use. Yes, of course, use it. It's just good all around. And then there's 2 other listings that they can use, which is list with criteria, which is basically the time in which a drug is recommended, but to be used under specific medical criteria. So one of the things that we know about Sofosbuvir and Telaprevir, the two new hepatitis C direct-acting antivirals that have been most recently available since 2011 and late 2011, early 2012, was that there's a criteria attached there, and it says that people have to have a MEDVIR liver scarring, fibrosis scarring level of 2 or above in order to be able to get access to hepatitis C treatment. So that's a medical criteria that the Common Drug Review might say to pharmaceutical plants, you should add this criteria in to limit the number of people who will need this medication. One of their options is also to say do not list at the current price. It requires the manufacturer to submit a different price. And then the final option is to not list, which in the space of HIV and hepatitis C, because the medications that come through, come available, are oftentimes so significantly more life-changing and life-saving than the ones that were previously available. This has rarely been used, although has been used a couple of times in the HIV side, the do not list recommendation. So before I move in to start talking more specifically about the current standard of care and what we can expect about Sofosbuvir, rather, is the case study, basically, of how the Common Drug Review made its decision for Telaprevir, the direct-acting antiviral that's been approved by the Common Drug Review in some circumstances since 2012, and it's been listed on some but not all public formularies as a part of a triple therapy for hepatitis C. So for hepatitis C genotype 1. So the recommendation that was made by the Common Drug Review at this particular moment in time was to list with conditions. So the CDR recommended that it be listed at a reduced price, which almost always comes through in terms of their list with conditions. Recommends that only people who have detectable RNA and a fibrosis level of F2 to F4, which I just said. Recommends only one 12-week course of treatment. So it limits the number of times people can undertake Telaprevir treatment. It also limits the amount of Telaprevir a person can take, or they're recommending that there's a limitation on the amount of Telaprevir a person can take, which may prove challenging. It didn't happen in this time. There may be some relevance in terms of this with some of the Sofosbuvir data that I'm going to share later. But you know, if studies had come out later that said actually a 16-week course of treatment with Telaprevir is much more effective, then there would have been a whole regulatory debacle that would have had to happen in order to change the recommendation, not just by the Common Drug Review, but then by the provincial and territorial formularies. And then also one of the things that we've talked about a lot at CTAC, and you can learn more about in our position paper, 2 Standards of Care Toward Treatment Equity for People Living with HIV and Hepatitis C Co-Infection, which is downloadable from our website, ctac.ca, is that Telaprevir as well as Boceprevir was specifically recommended by the Common Drug Review to not be provided to people living with HIV and Hepatitis C co-infection at first. This has since changed, but the ways in which many clinical trials are being conducted around hepatitis C treatment means that there are a lot of delays that are being made for people who are co-infected to get access to treatment. And as many of us on this webinar know, the complications that are associated with also living with hepatitis C, also living with HIV, while having hepatitis C means that once hepatitis C develops quite a bit faster, oftentimes making treatment very, very, very urgent for a lot of people. So this is a major concern. Okay. So I've talked a little bit about Boceprevir and Telaprevir and the processes by which they came to be approved and sold in Canada and covered by public health care. And so what I want to do then is talk about what's the current standard of hepatitis C treatment and why are improvements needed. And this will, as I said, this will be quite remedial for a lot of folks who are on this webinar. But currently, the standard of care for hepatitis C treatment is a 48-week regimen, so almost a year-long treatment of ribavirin, pegylated interferon, and Boceprevir, or ribavirin, pegylated interferon, and Telaprevir. And there's slight changes in this. So the ribavirin is a pill that's taken daily by folks for 48 weeks. Pegylated interferon is a weekly injection that people receive once a week for 48 weeks, and then Boceprevir is a pill that's taken through the entire course of treatment, and telaprevir is a series of pills taken a number of times a day throughout the first 12 weeks of treatment, but people stay on ribavir and pegylated interferon for the whole time. And so what we currently have is a long, arduous treatment where has varying levels of effectiveness and also, really importantly, a pretty infamous serious adverse event or side effect profile, some of which I've included here. So some challenges, again, associated with the current standard of care is the length of treatment. That 48 weeks or almost a full year is a really long time to ask people to undertake a hepatitis C treatment, especially a hepatitis C treatment that's hard to endure because of the serious adverse events associated especially with pegylated interferon, those weekly injections that result in people feeling constant flu-like symptoms, fatigue, and anemia. And then one of the things that happened in terms of adding boceprevir and telaprevir in late 2011 and early 2012 was at a time when there was a tremendous amount of optimism that we might be able to really drastically improve the effects of the SVR rates, the sustained virological response rates, the cure rates associated with hepatitis C treatment, that we might be able to improve those. And I think that all of us were blindsided a little bit with just how much worse adding boceprevir or telaprevir made the side effect profile for hepatitis C treatment. Major anemia symptoms associated with boceprevir, with people taking, I've heard from various people, up to 12 or 13 blood transfusions throughout the course of hepatitis C treatment. Some may have heard more, as well as a very, very, very serious and sometimes life-threatening rash associated with telaprevir that resulted in 2012 a black box warning being applied to the telaprevir label by the United States Food and Drug Administration, warning of this potentially life-threatening rash adverse event for people undergoing telaprevir treatment. So some really concerning serious adverse events. And then one of the other things that people noticed was a massive pill burden associated with both of these drugs. People having to take up to 5 boceprevir tablets up to 5 times a day, of people having to take 2 or 3, depending on body weight, telaprevir tablets, and the telaprevir tablets needing to be taken with food. And so people having to eat at least 150 calorie meal with at least 20 milligrams of fat in a meal was made being able to sort of undertake daily life, despite the fact that there were improvements in sustained virological response rates, but made daily life really, really, really challenging for people living with hepatitis C, in addition to the already difficult side effects associated with pegylated interferon. So there's some significant challenges, especially due to serious adverse events, as well as the length of time treatment takes in the current standard of care. Now, I said right at the end of what I was just saying that those adverse events may have been able to be sort of thought of in terms of a trade-off with a lot of folks, because the standard of care really was improved in terms of achieving sustained virological response rates. However, one of the things that we've learned since the widespread introduction of boceprevir and telaprevir is that in real-life settings, boceprevir and telaprevir aren't as effective as we may have once thought. So while clinical trial rates with treatment-naive patients showed 79% SVR rates for telaprevir and 66% SVR rates for boceprevir, a huge improvement in therapeutic outcomes compared to pegylated interferon and ribavirin therapy alone. That in this study, and this comes from the CTAC study, which is a series of hepatitis C treating institutions in Paris, showed that 60 weeks, so 12 weeks after the discontinuation of telaprevir and boceprevir treatment, in people who had significant liver fibrosis or cirrhosis, or people who were prior relapsers, that really only 40% and 41% of people were achieving sustained virological response. So people who are harder to treat actually were also not seeing amazing improvements in terms of the standard of care leading to sustained virological responses. So I think one of the things that we can say then around boceprevir and telaprevir and the state that we're in is that it was a very good thing that after a long period of time with almost no innovation in the hepatitis C treatment pipeline, that there were two medications which became available and have allowed more people to attain sustained virological response. There still is massive need in terms of the sustained virological response effectiveness across not just previous experiences with hepatitis C treatment or difficulty to treat, but across hepatitis C genotypes, keeping in mind that only genotype 1 for telaprevir and boceprevir, or only genotype 1 people living with hepatitis C are treated by telaprevir and boceprevir, as well as adverse event profiles and length of treatment. And so those are some of the things that I want to be addressing today, and that one of the things for those of you who elect to continue joining these webinars as CTAC participates in this process with future hepatitis C medications, is that we've come up with a bit of a yardstick, looking at a variety of other published sources. We've come up with a yardstick for what to us would represent an improvement in the standard of care for hepatitis C. So we're seeking a hepatitis C treatment that obviously first and foremost increases successful treatment outcomes of higher rates of SVR, moving toward a real functional hepatitis C cure for most people living with hepatitis C. On top of that, then, an improvement would be a shortened treatment period, because 48 weeks is too long for people to go on treatment. There's almost no way that people can manage having everyday life with any kind of side effect profile when treatment is that long and requiring such strict adherence as hepatitis C treatment does. We're interested very much in minimizing adverse events. The adverse event profile of the current standard of care is absolutely unacceptable, and so technological improvement is needed in order to reduce those. We're interested in lowering the pill burden. We're interested, and we'll get to this in a little bit, of the promises of an interferon-free treatment, because most of the serious adverse events that I was talking about earlier really are associated with pegylated interferon, and so we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then the final piece on this is we're interested in seeing hepatitis C treatment regimens come to the forefront, where a hepatitis C cure is something that can be reasonably expected out of for almost every person who's going to be going on treatment, or for every person who's going on treatment. So this is what we're hoping to see out of the treatment pipeline, and this is what we're using as our yardstick to measure where are we at and what's the contribution going to be made of where we're going. So I'm going to take a little sip of this before I lose my voice entirely, and then it lead us into a discussion of what we know from the clinical trials that have been published for Sofosbuvir. Okay, and this conversation is going to be basically split into two components, and I alluded to these at the very beginning of the webinar, of what we know now about Sofosbuvir and what we expect to know about Sofosbuvir a couple of years down the line in terms of its usefulness. And this will be a really important division to hold on to as I move through the next few slides. So I'm going to go through a few slides that present what we know now about Sofosbuvir and its effectiveness. And this information that I'm going to present is drawn from the phase 3 clinical trial results of 4 different studies about Sofosbuvir and its usefulness: the neutrino study, the fission study, the fusion study, and the positron study. So those are some pretty magnificent names. And so the neutrino study looked at the effects of Sofosbuvir in combination with ribavirin and pegylated interferon in treatment-naive people with genotypes 1, 4, 5, and 6. And I'm going to go into that a little bit more in just a second. The other 3 trials here looked at people who have genotype 2 or 3 hepatitis C, people for whom the current standard of care is just pegylated interferon and ribavirin for 24 weeks. So people who haven't seen a treatment advance with the last set of new treatment advances. And these trials have looked at people who are treatment experienced, treatment naive, as well as interferon intolerant or ineligible. I'll talk about that in just a minute of what they decided to include in that. The material that I'm presenting here comes from 2 articles that were published in the April 23rd, 2013 edition of the New England Journal of Medicine, authored by Lowitz and others and Jacobson and others. And there will be a link in the slide deck toward the end that can take you directly to these studies. And I'll be emailing the slide deck as well as a number of other materials to you at the end of this webinar. Okay. So first I want to talk about the neutrino study, which is the study of people living with hepatitis C with genotypes 1, 4, 5, and 6, who really importantly are treatment naive, so people who have not undertaken hepatitis C treatment before. Okay? As a part of the neutrino study, people were given sofosbuvir as well as pegylated interferon injections once weekly and daily doses of ribavirin for 12 weeks. Okay? And over those 12 weeks, this group of treatment naive folks, a little over more than about 326 people, achieved a sustained virological response, which is a really, really, really amazing number in comparison to even the most optimistic data in the telaprevir trials. Only had 79% of people achieving a sustained virological response. In the cimeprevir trials that I presented on for this patient population, that I presented on in August, in the August webinar, shows 80 to 81% sustained virological response rates. And in the real-life settings, as I presented before, 40 to 41% of people who'd undertaken boceprevir to telaprevir-based therapy achieved sustained virological response. So we're seeing a large potential for an increase in SVR, which is really great news. And of the people who did relapse, whose treatment did not result in a sustained virological response, 3 out of 6 people, that was because it was measured that they did not actually complete their treatment, which is also really kind of amazing that 3 of them did actually achieve a sustained virological response without finishing treatment, although I mean, all of us know that has happened from time to time. And that 25 out of 320 patients did relapse, were partial responders or relapsers. And so this is I think an important study that shows that sofosbuvir, in addition to the standard of care that we're used to, the pegylated interferon and ribavirin, does definitely improve treatment outcomes, improves treatment outcomes to a really high threshold. The disappointing piece is that at this point will still, that sofosbuvir is going to be going into Health Canada, into the Common Drug Review, and saying, for right now, for people living with genotype 1, 4, 5, and 6, sofosbuvir plus pegylated interferon. Although the end of interferon treatment for people with genotypes 1, 4, 5, and 6 is something that I'll talk about later on, and something that we can not start necessarily holding our breath about, but something to keep in the far horizon, as many of us have been keeping this data about sofosbuvir in the far horizon for a long time. So that's results from the first study that's going to be informing what the scientific side of what both Health Canada and the Common Drug Review are going to see when they're assessing, is sofosbuvir the right fit for Canadian public drug formulators and for the Canadian market in general. These are the results from 2 more of the studies that I identified a couple of slides ago from the fission and positron studies. And these have to do with people who were living with genotype 2 and 3 hepatitis C. So these are studies that result from people who were treatment naive and hadn't been treated for hepatitis C before, who received a combination of sofosbuvir and ribavirin. So sofosbuvir, a once daily dosing, ribavirin, a once daily dosing. So once daily doses of sofosbuvir and ribavirin for a 12-week period. And so the FISHION study measured the result of this for treatment-naive folks with genotype 2 or 3 and found that a combination of sofosbuvir and ribavirin resulted in people achieving a 67% sustained virological response. Now that number is not as good as certainly as the genotype 1, 4, 5, and 6 number that we saw in the last slide, but as you'll note in my note here on the slide, later down in the slide, this is the population where pegylated interferon and ribavirin is still the standard of care. Pegylated interferon and ribavirin for 24 weeks, so twice the time, result in a 67% SVR. So 12 weeks of sofosbuvir and ribavirin, something with a much less adverse event profile, which I'll talk about in a second, delivers the same results as pegylated interferon and ribavirin for twice the time, right? So what we're seeing here is a reflection of it's the same primary endpoint in terms of SVR results, but we're seeing data that's demonstrating that we now have the opportunity to cut treatment in half, as well as substantially reduce, even getting close to eliminate the adverse event profile for people living with genotype 2 and 3 hepatitis C who want to go on treatment. So this is really great news, even though it's not as good as it could be, because the bar graph is only at that 67% point for fission. In the positron study, this included a group of people who, the vast majority of whom were treatment naive, and people who, for medical reasons, were contraindicated from taking interferon, which I could share the list, but I'm not going to at this particular point in time. If you're interested, I'll send you the study afterwards. Or patients who were unwilling to take interferon. And in the context of this study, this was people who were included who said, I'm actually waiting for something else to happen because I have heard how awful pegylated interferon is, and I can't get myself to take it. And in that population, the sustained virological response for people who'd taken sofosbuvir, a combination of sofosbuvir and ribavirin, was actually much higher. It was a 78% sustained virological response rate. So we're seeing in these populations a good amount of sustained virological response for sofosbuvir and ribavirin, not pegylated interferon. So what we're seeing is good results, and results comparable to what we're currently using in the pegylated interferon environment without interferon for the first time. And this is, I think, something that all of us are very excited about. Okay. The last study that I'm going to share is the results from the FUSION study, and this was a study that experimented between, its primary question was how long to keep people on treatment, especially if they're treatment experienced and have been prior relapsers or null responders, et cetera. And so this study had one arm of folks receiving sofosbuvir and ribavirin for 12 weeks, and then another arm that had people receiving sofosbuvir and ribavirin for 16 weeks. All people who were treatment experienced, and it found that there was a significant higher SVR rate when people were given 16 weeks of treatment versus 12 weeks of treatment when they were treatment experienced, so that we see these 50% SVR rates for 12 weeks and 73% SVR rates for 16 weeks. So what we would see then, or the data that Gilead Sciences is going to give to the Common Drug Review, as well as to Health Canada, is going to say, you know, this is actually a really effective treatment for people who have genotype 2 and 3 hepatitis C, have been treated before, but they'll need 16 weeks of sofosbuvir plus ribavirin in order for it to be effective, and that the 12 weeks is actually just not enough. We know that we can do better with a longer course of treatment. So that's the data that we know right now, and that's the data from the studies that have concluded about hepatitis C. And I have a concluding slide to sort of sum all of that up. But first I want to address, what about people living with HIV and hepatitis C co-infection, which is a really significant issue that we work with here at CTAC, and something that I'm sure that a lot of folks on the call are concerned about finding out in terms of what's happening in terms of how Sofosbuvir is working with people living with HIV as well as HIV medications. So we're currently in the middle of an ongoing study, or rather Gilead Sciences is conducting a study right now that's ongoing, that's in phase 3 on the effectiveness of a combination of Sofosbuvir, pegylated interferon, and ribavirin with people living with HIV and hepatitis C co-infection who have hepatitis C genotypes 1, 2, and 3. Now, the great news is we're expecting to see the results of those studies, so the initial results of those studies between November 2013 and February 2014. And for those of you who have had the opportunity to look at CTAC's work on the 2 standards of care and the differential in treatment access for people living with hepatitis C monoinfection and HIV and hepatitis C co-infection, you'll know that this real difference between, like, we're about to see Sofosbuvir go to the regulator for people living with HIV, with hepatitis C monoinfection. Usually the studies about HIV co-infection come in much, much, much later, 2 to 3 years later. So we're going to see studies kind of come in around the same time as when Sofosbuvir is being assessed by the Common Drug Review for monoinfection, which I think is a really important thing, and may also allow folks like us to be able to say, you know, the decision that was made in the cases of boceprevir and falapravir to prevent people with HIV from accessing these treatments was actually really harmful. This data is about to be published, and this is something that the Common Drug Review and provincial, territorial, and federal formularies really should be looking at and not making that same mistake twice. Importantly, in terms of what we can expect around Sofosbuvir and HIV, is that a phase 1-2 study, I could get into why it was a split phase 1-2 study, but I'm not going to right now, has already demonstrated that there are no substantial drug-drug interactions between Sofosbuvir and these 4 major commonly used HIV treatments. So Atripla, rilpivirine, the protease inhibitor, the boosted protease inhibitor darunavir, ritonavir, and the integrase inhibitor raltegravir. And so for those of you who are familiar with HIV treatment, it's good in that it shows most of the major HIV treatments that are currently being used today, with the exception of a few, but it does show some data about drug-drug interactions across HIV drug class. And so especially in terms of, well, so sorry, that was a comment for a different drug. So this is a really encouraging finding around how Sofosbuvir is going to work with people living with HIV. Okay, so this is my summary point of the data that I've presented so far about Sofosbuvir. So what do we know about Sofosbuvir? We know that Sofosbuvir is safe and effective for people living with hepatitis C. We know that Sofosbuvir, unlike the direct-acting antivirals that most recently became available, boceprevir and falapravir, that were only effective for people living with hepatitis C genotype 1, that Sofosbuvir is effective across genotypes 1 through 6. We know that the co-administration with ribavirin and interferon for treatment-naive people living with genotypes 1, 4, 5, and 6 has a highly improved SVR rate of 90%, which is really great news. And we also know that the co-administration with ribavirin and not interferon for people living with genotypes 2 and 3 delivers similar or improved results on the currently available interferon-containing regimen. So it's the same or better without interferon. One of the things that's really important to talk about is adverse events, and it was hard for me to get a comprehensive amount of data onto one slide. And again, for anybody who's interested, the publications in the New England Journal of Medicine will be available to you after this webinar. But the adverse event profiles seen in the Sofosbuvir studies are not very substantial, and certainly not nearly as substantial in comparison to pegylated interferon-containing regimens. So across each of these 4 studies, only 1 to 2% of patients in each arm discontinued treatment due to adverse events. In the one study that did treat people with pegylated interferon and ribavirin as a placebo, as a control arm, 11% of people dropped out. So we're seeing substantially less dropouts in these clinical trial settings when interferon isn't being used. The most frequent adverse events that were reported were fatigue, nausea, headache, insomnia, and pruritus or itching, which was consistent across each of the arms of study, although higher in that one control arm where pegylated interferon was used. So we're seeing a reduced number of adverse events. I haven't included the percentages here, although those are available in the New England Journal of Medicine articles that will be available to you later. Okay, so you may have been sort of watching the webinar so far and looking at the clinical trial data and saying, okay, so we have stuff about genotypes 1, 4, 5, and 6, but only for treatment-naive folks. And we have more information about genotype 2 and 3 folks, but maybe not all of the questions have been answered. And you're right in terms of having maybe that reservation or that thought, in the sense that there's more that we need to know about Sofosbuvir, which is, I think, a really important piece to include in this discussion today. So one of the things that we need to know about Sofosbuvir is it as effective with treatment-experienced people who have genotypes 1, 4, 5, and 6, as it has been in people who are treatment-naive? I think is a really important question to ask, because we know across other studies that usually people who are treatment-naive fare better in terms of overall sustained virological response rates or cure rates than people who are treatment experienced. So it's a concern to me that this isn't something that we know at the time that this medication is going in to be considered by Health Canada and by the Common Drug Review. One of the things that always we need to know is how effective will this medication be with people living with HIV and hepatitis C co-infection? So will co-infected people be able to be treated as well or at all with this particular medication? So what's the effectiveness look like there? So we know a little bit about drug-drug interactions, but we don't know about how well it's going to work yet. Right? That'll be something that we'll learn more and we'll have to report on later. And then there's a third question that I want to include here, which is what will be the most effective combination therapies with Sofosbuvir? We have one study showing that with treatment-naive folks that Sofosbuvir works really well with pegylated interferon and ribavirin. But as we move away from a pegylated interferon era of being included in hepatitis C treatment, the question that we need to ask ourselves is, what are the drug combinations Sofosbuvir is going to work best with? And there's a pretty big reason why we may not be getting the full image on this, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But these are some things that we need to know. I wanted to include a slide here that addresses the first question on the previous slide, is it as effective with treatment-experienced people with genotypes 1, 4, 5, and 6? And that brings me to the next slide. For those of you who participated in our Semeprevir webinar in August, you may be asking, well, Paul, you were pretty excited about Semeprevir, this new protease inhibitor being offered by Janssen, and now you seem really excited about Sofosbuvir. What gives? How can you be excited about two things at the same time? And the answer really is, I think that Semeprevir, and this is a table showing the sustained virological response rates for people who were treated with pegylated interferon, ribavirin, and Semeprevir for 24 weeks, so for 6 months, who were treatment experienced. And that right now, in my estimation, I think the data shows that we know from the clinical trials that Semeprevir is a really effective treatment for people who are treatment experienced, with 85% SVR rates for people who are relapsers, up to 75% SVR rates for people who are partial responders, and up to 51% SVR rates for people who were null responders. And this is an important thing to keep in mind and is a really important bridge to my next set of remarks, that we're at a point in time where hepatitis C treatment is likely going to be a variety of different, potentially complicated, possibly sort of patient-specific or certainly genotype and treatment experience-specific regimens that maximize individuals' responses to the hepatitis C treatments so that they have the best hope of having a sustained virological response. So I think that it's really important that we have as many tools in our arsenal as possible. That Sofosbuvir is one, and Sofosbuvir certainly is another one. So going back to the slide that I included before we started talking about Sofosbuvir, from the clinical trial data, we can map some of the things that are on our wish list, actually, about Sofosbuvir. Certainly Sofosbuvir increases successful treatment outcomes. At the very least, holds treatment outcomes without interferon for people living with genotypes 2 and 3. And in the pegylated interferon included trials for genotypes 1, 4, 5, and 6, there's a pretty substantial increase in successful treatment outcomes, up to a 90% sustained virological response, which is very encouraging. Sofosbuvir, and I didn't talk about this so much in my other remarks, in my earlier remarks, but it shortens treatment. So Sofosbuvir is being looked at as a 12-week or a 3-month as opposed to a year-long or even a 6-month treatment, and going up to a maximum of 16 weeks or 4 months for harder to treat cases. And so we're seeing this important piece around shortening treatment. We're seeing adverse events minimized, something that I wasn't able to demonstrate well enough in the slide deck here today, but you'll see in the New England Journal of Medicine article that the proportion of people who are experiencing significant adverse events while undergoing hepatitis C treatment on Sofosbuvir-based regimens, especially when they don't include pegylated interferon, is reducing a great deal. So we're looking at a less arduous hepatitis C treatment. We're seeing a lowered pill burden, so not the 5 or 3 pills a day associated with Boceprevir and Telaprevir, but 1 Sofosbuvir, 1 Ribavirin, and potentially a weekly injection of pegylated interferon. For genotypes 2 and 3, we're seeing interferon-free treatment. We're seeing potentially, and this will be on my next slide, the promises of an interferon-free treatment for people with other genotypes, including people with genotype 1, the most common genotype that we see here in Canada. We don't win yet on a functional hepatitis C cure for everyone, but I include in parentheses here, but promising to sort of think through what's on this slide, which is the potential future uses of Sofosbuvir. So I want to share what's currently being addressed in some current phase 3 trials that are being undertaken. So a combination of Sofosbuvir and Ledipasvir, which is either with or without Ribavirin for people who have genotype 1, is currently in a phase 3 trial, and this is Ledipasvir is another Gilead drug. It's an NS5A inhibitor. Sofosbuvir is an NS5B inhibitor that, working together, seems like it may be able to increase sustained virological response rates up to close to 100% for people living with genotype 1 without the use of pegylated interferon. So this is currently a trial that's being undertaken with treatment-naive folks, as well as treatment-experienced folks, and experimenting between a 12 or 24-week treatment arm to see if there's any kind of difference. So that's what we're seeing in phase 3. So this is a really exciting use for Sofosbuvir. This medication is going to be assessed under a different set of conditions that maybe a couple of years down the road, Gilead Sciences may come and say, look, we've developed this new drug, Ledipasvir, that means that we won't have to use interferon treatment anymore for almost anyone. That really has lowered the side effects. So what we're asking is not for all new drugs to be sort of approved at the same time. We're going to have this add-on drug in addition to this really great drug that's hopefully already on the market in terms of Sofosbuvir, right? There's also a phase 3 trial that's being undertaken with just Sofosbuvir and Ribavirin with genotypes 1, 2, 3, and 4. So it's the continuing on of the genotype 2 and 3 trials, and basically adding the same theory for genotypes 1 and 4 that was being done in the 2 and 3 trials. So would a 12, 16, or 24-week course of treatment with just Sofosbuvir and Ribavirin be effective for people with genotypes 1 or genotypes 4. Many of you on the webinar will also probably be familiar of a missed opportunity of a trial that was stopped in phase 2A, which looked at a combination of Sofosbuvir and the Bristol-Myers Squibb company drug Declatosphere, which is a drug that will be looking to come to market in its own right in the next year to year and a half. That looked at these two drugs together and were showing early indications of a near 100% sustained virological response rates. And so this is, it's heavily speculated that one of the reasons why this combination wasn't continued to be studied was that many companies are interested in getting combinations of their own drugs to the market first, as the hepatitis C market is very much expanding and looking to become more lucrative. But it's I think important to keep in mind as we move forward too in doing patient input work is that there's a role to be had for Health Canada and for the Common Drug Review as regulators or technology assessors to talk about how potential new offerings might be able to be fit together in order to provide the best treatment outcomes for all people living with hepatitis C. Okay, so that's the end of the information component of my presentation. And so what I wanted to do now is open it up to questions as well as to any sort of discussion points. And so as we talked about beforehand, the best and easiest way for me to facilitate discussion is for you to click on the raise hand button. And so that's what I'll use to moderate the discussion. As well as then once we've had a little bit of a discussion period or an opportunity for questions and answers, I will let you know how you can have your voice in and also how you can help spread the word to get as many people living with Hep C, people who have undergone hepatitis C treatment, as well as service providers to be able to feed into this process so that at CTAC we can have a patient input submission that's as strong as possible. So I'm going to open it up then for questions. So please feel free to just click on the raise hand button if you have one. Give everybody a second here. Okay. Oh, I have one question from Mark. So Mark, I need you to press #6 so we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I don't use the #6. I have a mute button on my phone. It's very handy.
Probably the way to go.
It's not really a question on the presentation. I think my question is more around how can we encourage other people to take a look at this and give input and provide feedback and help you create this document and referral that you're trying to create for CTAC to move forward with the drug?
So thank you, Mark. That's exactly the key component to bring us forward here. So there's a couple of things that will be available to you, and again, thank you all for coming and participating in this webinar. So this webinar is recorded, and so it will be up and available on our website by the end of the day. And so what I'll do is do an email follow-up with each of you at the end of the day with the link to that recording, so that folks who missed the webinar today and want to learn more about the drug before participating and saying, well, this is what I think about it, have an opportunity to engage in this in this learning opportunity. So that's point one. Point two then is that I will be providing each of you with a link to the survey, not just at the end of this webinar, but I'll be providing it to you by email, at which point you, as well as anybody that you want to send this survey to, And I especially encourage you, especially those of you who work in direct service provision environments, to send this to as many people with lived experience as you can, because the inclusion of voices of people with lived experience make for the strongest submissions. And so there's a lot of scientific evidence as to why this is a promising improvement to the treatment cascade for hepatitis C. But the Canadian Drug Expert Committee that makes up the Common Drug Review, they already know the science. So one of the things that we really need to convey is what's the voice of patients, of people living with Hep C, of community leaders, right? So that's really what we're going for. So the availability of this webinar is an educational piece, but the encouragement of each of you to submit the survey to as many interested folks and listservs and connections as you have will be totally instrumental to this process. Did I answer the question, Mark?
Yes, thank you.
Great, thank you, Mark. And then I have a question from Laura. Laura, if you want to press #6 to unmute your line.
Hi, Paul. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi. Okay. I work for an ASO in BC, and my perception is that cost quite often comes up in conversations with people when they're talking to their doctor about treatment. So if the treatment is shorter, we can expect the cost to be lower, but can you speak at all about if Sofosbuvir is a cheaper drug?
Unfortunately, the process by which cost is sort of shared and determined means that we all go into this process of a drug being approved and then assessed by the Common Drug Review with those of us on the community or civil society side not knowing what the cost is.
Right.
So cost is currently a prohibited secret number shared only between the manufacturer and the Common Drug Review, and it won't even be shared at the point at which the Common Drug Review decision is made. What then will happen is, because the Common Drug Review basically just gives advice to the public formularies, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the public formularies will negotiate the price with the individual manufacturers. So, so unfortunately, we don't know what the price of Sofosbuvir will be yet, and I'm hesitant to sort of say anything because I really don't know. Although what I've heard is that the cost of Sofosbuvir, because it does represent sort of a novel improvement on what we've been using, that it may be sort of the step or the gateway to getting away from interferon therapy, is that we're looking at the sticker price of Sofosbuvir may be higher than certainly the sticker price for boceprevir and telaprevir. So,
right. Okay. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, for sure. So we don't know sort of the effects that will have on yet. And again, it's an important thing to keep in mind, right, that we need to keep in mind what the price of Sofosbuvir will be, because we don't know what it's going to get paired with yet either down the long run, right, with what's the ideal drug combination therapy going to be.
Right. Okay.
So the next question is from Jeff. So Jeff, if I can get you to unmute.
Can you hear me, Paul?
I can hear you.
Excellent. I'm just wondering, from today going forward, what time frame are we looking at that you estimate before we might see this on the market?
On the market, you said?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm gonna answer your question, then also use it to answer a second question, which is one that will give you an idea of the timeline for this particular exercise. So. This will really depend. The answer to it's hard to give an exact answer, although I can kind of give some broad strokes about when we might be able to expect this. So Gilead Sciences has gone in to request the Common Drug Review to look at and assess this medication prior to it being approved by Health Canada, which is not the way things went with boceprevir and telaprevir. So Gilead has said, okay, things are looking pretty good about, you know, the findings of these clinical trials. We expect it to be approved by the Food and Drug Administration midway through December. So we're going to try and get two pieces of the Canadian regulatory work done at the same time. So that's a really encouraging thing. They're trying to get, you know, step 1 and step 2 in that map that we had way earlier. taken care of as quickly as possible so that they can then go ahead and negotiate the price and availability with individual provincial, territorial, and federal formularies. So I think that we can expect that the Common Drug Review and Health Canada component around Sofosbuvir will be done somewhere between January and April, May. And then depending on how keen and how quick individual formularies are to cover this new medication, I mean, it could be as early as next fall that it would be publicly available. I would say that it would be incredibly optimistic to think that there would be public availability of this medication anytime before approximately a year from now. Unfortunately, that's just the sort of slow wait of the regulatory process in Canada, and kind of also a little bit unfortunate to say, right, that that's actually probably about as quickly as it can go. So we're looking at a relatively speaking, all things being equal, encouraging timeline, but we're still looking at public availability if all of the decisions are positive at some time in the fall of next year.
Great, thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Jeff. And then I have a question from Laura, unless that's the last question that you had, but you can ask another one if you want to. But you'd need to press #6 to unmute.
Hi, Paul. Sorry, I didn't lower my hand.
Oh, that's okay. All right. Does anybody else have any questions before we move into the concluding part of the webinar? Okay. Seeing none, what I want to do is I'm about to share with each of you, and again, you'll receive this by email as a follow-up, but I'm going to share with you a link for each of you to be able to fill out a survey. It should take about 10 to 15 minutes. And it's based off of the questions that are included in the patient input submission form for the Common Drug Review, which is the form that we as CTAC will complete as in our role as a patient group interested in seeing the improvement of hepatitis C care. And so these questions will ask you either in your capacity as a person living with hepatitis C or somebody who's taken treatment and has a sustained virological response, or somebody who has an interest in improved health outcomes for people living with hep C as somebody who's a service provider. It will ask you some questions about what's the impact of hepatitis C on you or on the people that you work with or the people that you care about, the impact of current treatment, including adverse events, the impact on caregivers and service providers, and then also there'll be a question for those of you who may have been on Sofosbuvir as part of a clinical trial, and we're also working to connect this survey with people who were part of the clinical trials for Sofosbuvir, what your experience on the drug may have been in comparison to what you know about what the current standard of care is. The important thing to point out, and again I'll include this in the follow-up email that will come out either at the end of today or early tomorrow morning, we have until just at the end of the weekend to collect patient input. So the troubling thing about the patient input process is that it's really, really, really lickety-split. So the announcement comes and then 15 business days later, we have to make this submission. And so that means that we have to organize a national webinar and take our SVPs, as well as include this patient input feedback. So that's why you will have noticed that it was a really short turnaround on when you heard about the webinar, and again now when we're going to close the survey. So this survey that I'm about to give to you will be available until until midnight between Sunday and Monday morning of next week. So I do request that each of you send out the email follow-up piece that I'm going to send to you as quickly as possible so that we can get as much and extensive feedback as we can. Okay. Again, I'll email the slide deck, but it has the links here. The Lawitz and the Jacobson are the two New England Journal of Medicine articles if you want to learn more, as well as the top link here is to the pipeline report, which is a co-production by the Treatment Action Group in New York and the British organization iBase on what to expect in the treatment pipeline in the coming years. And the treatment pipeline is something that I'm always interested in talking about. So you can always feel free to contact me with any questions that you have about sort of what to be expecting and when in terms of both the HIV and the hepatitis C pipelines. That's something that I'm always interested in talking about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a link here. And so for those of you who want to go to the feedback survey right away, I suggest that you click on the text that says feedback survey and then on the browse to button, and that's going to take you into our external SurveyMonkey site to collect information about Sofosbuvir. Again, it will be emailed to you as well as with the link to the recorded version of the webinar as well as to the slide deck. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank each of you for participating and taking time over Tuesday afternoon, and look forward to seeing your responses to this feedback survey as well as to the responses of anybody that you can connect to this feedback survey to. So appreciate your time, and we look forward to having you on future CTAC webinars. Take good care, everyone.